Hello, BookTube. We're continuing with our list of the 100 greatest books of all time. And before we get to today's 10, I thought I would address some of the people who've been emailing me with questions of exclusion and representation. I'm not going to go through a 20-minute diatribe again about what I am talking about when I talk about the 100 greatest books of all time, but I am talking about books that exist in the real world. And the real world has only one canon. There is no alternate canon. So I want to direct any of those people who are asking those questions, also anybody who comes to these videos long afterwards in the future, to look at the first video in this series, the one that starts with book number 100. I explain my criteria, if you want to call it that, in that video. So we're just going to move ahead with the books for today, and we're going to start with the Decameron by Boccaccio, a treasure trove of stories, of little novels. Just dozens and dozens and dozens of little novels set against the wonderful backdrop of this is the plague. It's a plague comes to Italy, and a small group of people retire into a country house and pass the time by telling stories. And they all have a wonderful store of stories to tell. This has had a number of different English language translations. If you're reading it just in English, I would do a little bit. Of course, you're going to want, with any translation, that's also a question I've been getting in emails, with any translation, you're going to want to go with the translation that appeals to you the most, the one that works for you the most. Do not worry about scholarly bona fides of any translation. You can worry about that later. The key is to fall in love with the book. So try as many translations as you can get your hands on and go with the one that you like the most. And I agree that I definitely say that with this book and every other translated work on this list. But once you've done that, once you're in love with the book, then when it comes to something like the Decameron that has a racy element to it, you really want to avoid Bowdlerized versions. You want to avoid English language translations where the translator is pulling Boccaccio's punches, because that will almost certainly always mean that he's blunting Boccaccio's humor, and you don't want to do that. So, I'm not talking about loose versus prude. I'm talking about blunting the artistry of the writer. You don't want a Bowdlerized version, because that's what will happen. So give it a try in any English language version, but then piece your way accordingly. Then this next one you won't need a translator if you're a monoglot English reader, because this is an English work. It's a work of poetry. It is a foundational work of English poetry. It's from 1798. It's the Lyrical Ballads. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, this is their book that widely is seen as kicking off the romantic poetry movement, but it's also an amazing book on its own. Here in a Penguin Classic, but you can find this in any kind of edition, including a great many of the books that I talk about are on, for instance, sites like Project Gutenberg for free. So you don't need to worry about it at all. If you e-read, you don't need to worry about it at all. But Lyrical Ballads is it's a really enjoyable experience apart from being so historically important. Then we move to 1623. This is definitely a book, even though it is a collection of plays that I would argue, most of them were never thought of by their author as books. Nevertheless, the book in question is Shakespeare's first folio. I wish I could show you a big, fat Penguin Classic paperback of the first folio with a great introduction and great notes, but such a thing has never been made. As far as I know, such a thing has almost never been made of the first folio by any publisher. Dover, Bantam, Signet, Oxford, Wordsworth Classics, Penguin Classics, as far as I know, nobody has ever done that with the first folio of Shakespeare, which introduces us to a large number of Shakespeare plays that we have nowhere else. We would not have them if we didn't have the first folio. I wouldn't advise you going out and buying one, because they are quite expensive, but it would be nice if there were many reprint volumes of this, with an introduction to carefully set you in the time and tell you all about it, and tell you all about its influence, and then notes to explain what's here and what's not here, and the normal textual notes that you need with Shakespeare. That would be great, but we don't have it, so I wanted to put it on a list anyway. Then we'll move way back in time, from 1623 to 523, so 1500 years earlier, to, believe it or not, a work of philosophy. We're dealing here with Boethius, The Consolation of Philosophy. This is a little Harvard University Press edition that I strongly recommend. If you can get the paperback version of it, you'll really like the blurbs. And this is basically Boccaccio's story, or not Boccaccio, Boethius. This is his story of Dame Philosophy, of the personification of serene wisdom, visiting him in prison and telling him all about the consolations of the introspective intellectual life. He was in prison awaiting exoneration. He was certain that his friends back in the city were going to get him exonerated, or at least paroled. He was not expecting that he would actually be executed. And he was. He was executed. And in a detail that is usually left out of most historical accounts of Boethius, he was executed in a particularly brutal way. It was not an easy end. He didn't have his head cut off. This is a classic Durance Vile work of literature and is tremendously engaging. I would recommend this translation, but I'd recommend there have been other good translations. It's not like it's hard to come by. Then we'll move. The Consolation of Philosophy is somber, and it's rendered more somber when you know the fate of its author, which he did not know when he was writing it. So we'll move to something much more fun, and that is Orlando Furioso by Ludovico Ariosto. This is a gigantic Renaissance Italian verse epic, about Roland. The Orlando in the title here is Roland from the Song of Roland. In this book, he is a gallant knight who is superpowered. He is invulnerable. So do you do anything? He's superpowered and he's invulnerable and super strong. So he's not a normal being. He's a super being in this poem. But in the poem, more importantly, he is insane. He is furioso. He has lost his mind because he was first in Amorato, because he was first in love, and love has driven him insane. He has lost his wits. They are on the moon. You don't know that, but they're on the moon. He is insane, and he is ravaging the countryside as an insane being. Of course, if a knight goes insane, that's usually a problem for his king and his buddies. But if a knight who's super strong and invulnerable goes insane, that's a problem for everybody. But he's just the kernel of this incredibly long poem, which this is the Harrington translation. I could tell you endless stories about this particular translation. But there's a 2-volume Penguin translation that's wonderful, just wonderful. And that is just a kernel of this poem. It goes on from there to literally everywhere. Oh my God, it just never stops. It is a gigantic rolling river of fun narration. Believe it or not, a gigantic 2 thick volumes in Penguin Classic, a gigantic verse epic from the Italian Renaissance. I know that's a hard sell. I've never been able to successfully sell this, but it's unbelievably fun. Which is if you just look at it on a library shelf, it's the last word that would come to your mind. But it's unbelievably fun. Not just the jokes that are played with poor Orlando, but with everybody else as well. This is set against the backdrop of the Song of Roland. So you have Christians versus Muslims, but the Ariosto complicates everything that he touches, and in wonderful ways. So I know that it's a lot to ask, but we'll go from 2 gigantic volumes in the Penguin Classic to a very slim volume, something that will take you no more than 30 minutes to read, less than that. But it's unbelievably wonderful. It will live with you your whole life. This is Marjorie Williams, and we're talking about The Velveteen Rabbit. This is a kid's book about a little stuffed rabbit. And life and loss, and especially what it means to achieve personhood. And of all the kids' books that I know, kids' books often pack in a lot of wisdom. They are very pleasant for their kids. Of course, they are very pleasant for the kids who read them. 3 generations of children have grown up loving this book. But the really good ones, and this is one of the best, they also aim straight at the heart of the adults who are reading them. They contain elements in them that no child will understand. But those elements will be in the children once they've read the book. And they might not even remember where they got that wisdom, but it will be there for them. And if they come back to the book, they'll find it. They'll find it right where they left it. It's sad and beautiful. And I strongly, strongly recommend it. Then we'll move to a book that is very similar in some ways to The Consolation of Philosophy. It is one of the first examples of its kind to appear in human literature. This is the Confessions of St. Augustine. And this is the Penguin Classic, but really any translation will do. This is not a book where you really need to worry about bowdlerization. This will just be a straight-up question of whether or not the translator is interesting to you. But here, it's Augustine talking about himself in ways that very few writers had even briefly done before him. In ways that you have to look to something like the poetry of Horace or Catullus in order to find this kind of raw immediacy. And with the poetry of Horace or Catullus, a lot of that raw personal immediacy is a literary gimmick. It's not honest. It's not them telling the truth about themselves. A lot of times it is, but a lot of times it isn't. And here, this is utterly remarkable. The more familiar you are with the classical literature whose long roots run through this book, this was sort of the end of it. The end of what we commonly consider classical literature. This was sort of the end of it. The more you look through that classical literature, the stranger this book is when you get to it. The more modern it feels. I hate to use that word, especially as a compliment, but I think you know what I mean. This is very much a conception of the self that the ancients did not have or did not commit to paper that we do have. And unbelievably influential as well. We'll move to a little bit. Oh, The Velveteen Rabbit is an unconventional choice. I defy you to tell me it doesn't belong on this list. This next one is also unconventional, but wonderful and utterly moving. I've never recommended this to someone or known someone who read it who wasn't incredibly moved by it. And that is Gavin Maxwell. This is Ring of Bright Water, which is nature writing. It's his accounts of him encountering various animals, but the main animal, the animal that steals the show, is an otter. And it is powerful and incredibly eloquent and memorable and also heartbreaking. This is a heartbreaking book. It's nature writing in a way. I suppose you could dismiss it that way, but I take great writing where I find it. Then we'll move forward to the 18th century. This is going to be, when we're talking, as we will on a list like this, the Nightmare of Translation. This is going to be a book that almost everybody that reads it is going to have to read in translation, even the people who are from the culture that for which it is a literary foundation. And that is The Story of the Stone, or Dream of the Red Chamber, which is from the 18th century. Penguin makes a multi-volume edition of this. I don't know if they still do. I don't know of any big one-volume edition of this. There should be one. Penguin should make one. Someone should make one. A new translation of this, a big 1,000-page hardcover with onion skin pages, maybe double-columned onion skin pages, with a big, generous introduction and lots of notes. That is what this needs. It is an absolutely wonderful, memorable story of the shaping of a family, but it hasn't been given the treatment that it deserves in the West in 200 years. And that's a shame, because at our present moment in the 21st century, you can say lots of negative things about the 21st century. I occasionally do. But the 21st century reader there's never been a reader more adventurous in terms of reading outside of their narrow world. It makes sense in a way, because we all have phones in our pockets that connect us immediately to everywhere in the world except North Korea. It makes sense in a way that the 21st century readers would be less provincial than any reader who's come before them. But it's still wonderful to see. Even if you could theoretically, bloodlessly predict it, it's still wonderful to see. Which means that we ought to be engaging here in the 21st century, while we still can, in an absolute renaissance of translated material. You shouldn't have to go to these old Penguin Classic volumes are pretty good. They are pretty involving, but you shouldn't have to do this. You shouldn't have to jump from, do I have volume 1? Do I have volume 3? Where are they? Are they in the right condition? Are they in the same size? There should be multiple editions of this available in really inviting English language translations, and there aren't. So I strongly, strongly recommend it. It is an amazing, a towering work. Even seen through a glass darkly in the what I have to assume are the cramped English versions that I've experienced in, it's still amazing. So the Penguin will definitely recommend it, even though I can daydream about other versions that don't exist yet, or that exist but I don't know about them. And then we'll finish up with something that needs no translation if you are a monoglot English reader, but you may have skipped it, or you may know this author from other works. This is Roughing It by Mark Twain, a nonfiction work that is a narrative ensemble, a narrative collection of some of his favorite stories about domestic travel and his domestic experience. It's 2 parts autobiography, it's 2 parts travelogue, it's 2 parts tall tale. It's remarkable. There's no book like it in American history. And it's also extremely fun. So you see an old dusty hardcover of this on a shelf, or maybe you've got a big volume that combines this with Innocents Abroad, and you might have the same reaction to it that you would have to those 2 big fat penguin volumes of Ariosto. But no, in both cases, you shouldn't indulge in that reaction, because in both cases you're missing a whole bunch of fun. Mark Twain is the same as Ariosto. I don't know that anyone's ever compared the two of them. I don't think he ever read Ariosto, but he's the same as Ariosto in that the serious and even beautiful or moving stuff is there for you to find in the work, but it's going to be heavily layered over with business, bits of business, moving action on the stage, and also humor. So it won't be a hollow experience. You will be able to find those deeper elements, but you'll also have a wonderful time while you do it. So there you go. That is the next 10 books in our 100 best books of all time. So I will post this. A lot of you are pleasing me by telling me your counts so far. Some of you are racking up your counts of which ones you've had, which ones you've read. One of you very amusingly is keeping me updated on which ones you've even heard of, which is great. Happy to do it. We will continue. We will move on next time in our inexorable march towards number 1. What will be the very best book ever written? We'll find out when we get there. Thank you, BookTube.